Okay, so welcome everyone. Apologies that I'm joining you digitally here. This is usually a talk that I come out and do at respective schools, but time constraints has obviously meant that I haven't been able to do it in this instance for you. So I hope this video will suffice. We're going to be talking about what you can see up here on the slides. I want to be talking to you about a book called The Pleasure Trap, and this talk I sort of more broadly call Pleasure Traps. And the text is by a couple of authors, two doctors by the name of Doug Lisle and Alan Goldhammer. One is a psychologist, one is a physician. And together they have a very interesting insight into what they refer to as essentially mastering the hidden forces that undermine health and happiness. That's the subtitle to their book. I prefer to call this a problem derived from this artificial world we live in. And this is what I want to talk to you about, because essentially there are a great many number of behaviors that we exhibit in the modern world, in the post-industrial world, that just aren't any good for us at all. And annoyingly, this is also something that we know to be the case, yet we find it really hard to action positive behavior. And instead, short-term gratification is something that, unfortunately, is all too easy for us just to allow ourselves to sort of slip into and allow ourselves to sort of follow that path. I myself was a heavy drinker and smoker, as well as a junk food addict for many, many years. And those are still things that I kind of battle with, I suppose. And I was also incredibly sedentary for a long period of time. I didn't do any exercise. I didn't look after myself at all. I suppose you could say that I had succumbed to my feelings rather than, logically and rationally looking at what would be best for me. But I hope I'll show you in this talk that it's not as simple as that. And saying things like, people that are overweight or people that are addicted to drink or drugs or whatever, that they're lazy, they're stupid, they're weak. I don't think any of these things are true. In fact, a lot of the time, addicts are very conscientious, very driven, and very dedicated people. It just so happens, unfortunately, that that tends to be directed towards something that is slowly destroying their lives, rather than something that is slowly building them up to be the best versions of themselves that they can be. And just before we launch into the main content, I do want to say that I don't think that this description I'm giving you is a complete solution to any of the problems that we face, rather just a small piece of the puzzle, but I do think a very important piece of the puzzle. So, as I've said, we kind of know, like if I asked you what food is healthy to eat or what sort of things shouldn't we do, you'd say, well, we should try and eat as many plants, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, pulses, etc. as possible. You might throw words like free range and organic around. Or possibly you'd say, don't smoke, don't vape, don't do this, don't do that. And they would all be perfectly proper things to say. But these are only quandaries that have plagued humanity in recent years. And there were two great revolutions that occurred that are often heralded as being very important, and I certainly wouldn't deny their importance, but being sort of the best thing since sliced bread. To have happened to humanity. And while I do think they've had some really positive and beneficial outcomes, there's also been a lot that we are still having to wrestle with. And these two revolutions are, of course, the agricultural revolution, when we invented farming about 15,000 years ago or so, and then the industrial revolution from about a few hundred years ago, where we applied processes of farming to processes of industry, scientific methodology, and we get the world that we live in today. And, things like modern medicine, brilliant. But unfortunately, our nature hasn't caught up. And it's sometimes said that we have a biological blueprint from 100,000 years ago. We have social structures based from the Renaissance, yet we have technology of the gods. So we do find ourselves in quite a delicate position as modern Homo sapiens. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. So, why is it that we constantly pursue short-term gratification, even when so much of our mind, our conscious selves, is telling us that, maybe we shouldn't do that, maybe we shouldn't gamble, maybe we shouldn't watch pornography, maybe we should spend a little bit less time gaming or on social media or whatever it is. And I'm here to argue that essentially we are built to be addicts, unfortunately. It's just that the addiction didn't kick in until after the agricultural and particularly the industrial revolutions. It's our nature to live in a world that is different from the one that we live in. And I think this is part of why we struggle so much with things that on the face of it should be easy, like just don't drink excessive quantities of alcohol, don't take drugs, don't watch pornography. Like if it was as simple as doing that, then we'd all be free from many of the plagues that curse us as people. And whether or not you're an addict at the moment, you will certainly know people that are addicts to things, and you will certainly become addicted to something, whether that's a screen or alcohol or whatever else. And it might be a very minor form of addiction, but sometimes it might be a little bit more serious. And I think that's why it's really good for us to consider openly and honestly talking about and discussing these really difficult matters. Because it's easy just to bury our head in the sand and pretend like there isn't a problem. But I think deep down we all know socially there is a really big and pressing set of issues that we need to talk about. So let's start with this troubling question. Why is it, when we know all of the health risks, do we still engage in this self-destructive behavior? And this is a question that we're going to return to at the end, and I hope I will provide an answer of sorts for you to at least ponder. So in order to demonstrate, I suppose, the main gist of what this Pleasure Traps talk is about, I want you to consider the grey shrike. This is a proud bird of the Mid-Eastern desert, and this also forms the basis of the discussion in the book, The Pleasure Trap. And I want to ask you why it is that the male grey shrike spends an awful lot of time flying around all day, collecting bugs and thorns and whatever else, and creating a really elaborate nest, a nest that's far too large for him to live in, a little bit like a billionaire buying a house with 57 bedrooms and bathrooms or whatever. There's just literally no need for it at all. So why does the grey shrike do this? And actually the answer is kind of the same, a little bit more complex with humans. But it's to show off. It's particularly to show off to a member of the opposite sex. What the grey shrike is looking to achieve, essentially, is a mate. He's looking to copulate, he's looking to reproduce. And that is a base biological drive that underpins so many of us. It is sex that results in his behavior here, often behavior that will detract from finding food and other really important endeavors and forays that this creature is going to make, and all animals, of course, as well. So, yeah, it is sex that drives this, and he's compelled by his genes to work in a particular type of way. So his genes sort of build his neural circuitry, okay? His instincts come from this, if you like. And in turn, this gives rise to thoughts. Now, in the case of the grey shrike, these aren't self-reflective thoughts. He doesn't have a moral compass, for example. He doesn't know that things like, torture is wrong and whatever else. But he does still think, and it's maybe not as different as we might like to, potentially think. Maybe we consider ourselves to be way above all of these other creatures, but perhaps the reality is a little different from that. Anyway, these thoughts give rise to feelings, and it's the feelings that I really want to focus on today, because I've got feelings, you've got feelings, we've all got feelings, and they are actually very, very important, but maybe not quite in the way that you think. And these feelings really, they act as signposts, as signals. They're cues that point us in the correct direction, at least in evolutionary terms. But it's not the signals, it's not the feelings that are the problem, it's the world that we now inhabit, it's the world that we live in, because this world is an incredibly artificial, kind of fake plastic place, if you like, compared to the world that we've evolved to thrive in as hunter-gatherers. So our feelings will often drive us towards behavior that are detrimental to us in the long term. You can think of the behavior of moths at the night time. You might have noticed that when you're using an electronic device in the evenings, or maybe you've got a light on, that various different insects will be attracted towards that light. And maybe they'll even headbutt that light over and over again, and perhaps they'll even drop down from fatigue for continually trying to get to this source of light. Maybe they'll even drop down dead. Perhaps they'll get stuck in the light. Maybe they'll burn. One way or another, it's not a pretty state of affairs for these poor insects. And the temptation as a human is to say, well, they're stupid creatures, and that's that. That's why they're dying. That's why they're getting hurt in this way. But unfortunately, they're not stupid creatures at all. And the reason why insects sort of head towards the light is a very complex set of biological and biochemical circumstances, and we don't actually fully understand it. But what we do understand is that they use the light as a way to navigate, to know where they are. And that's well and good, until Edison invents the light bulb 150 years ago. And then suddenly, all of these very bright artificial sources of light completely bamboozle the base instincts of these creatures. There is an expression, a moth to flame, mindlessly going towards something that you don't fully understand or don't fully appreciate. And while there might have been the odd lightning strike, that wasn't enough evolutionary pressure to make the moths and other insects adapt. However, there hasn't been enough time since Edison invented the light bulb in order for them to adapt to this new world that we live in. And I would argue that none of us are fully adapted to this new post-industrial world that we live in. It comes with many traps, many minefields for us to cross. So all animals are driven by what's called the motivational triad, these three areas. We are hedonistic, we seek pleasure, we look to avoid pain as well at all times, and we also try and be as efficient as possible with our forays, with what we use our energy to achieve. And in many respects, this is why going for a McDonald's drive-through is so much better, in our minds. It feels so much better than, going and foraging for your food in the wild. In those two instances, you're going to get much more instantaneous pleasure from the McDonald's. You're certainly going to avoid accidentally picking mushrooms that might kill you or whatever else. You're certainly not going to have to get cold and damp and, have to look everything up in terms of what it is that you can and can't eat. And you're also going to waste a lot of energy doing that. So actually just driving in your car, doing the little tap on the payment system and just getting the food, and if you want, just stuffing your face with it right there, that seems a lot more appealing to us. And I'm going to try and demonstrate sort of some of the processes that are going on here by returning to the grey shrike. So they've run tests on these sort of creatures, and essentially, if you put a grey shrike in a sort of an aviary and you give him, the male grey shrike, a few options, we see the same sort of behavior being exhibited time and time again. So we give the grey shrike two buttons, a red button and a blue button. And if he presses the blue button, he can fly out into a much bigger aviary, and he can do all the things that grey shrikes do, just live a normal grey shrike life. There might be some females that he will want to impress, some other males that he will have competition with. He's going to go around, he's going to collect his bugs and thorns and sticks and all of that stuff, and he's going to try and build a nest to impress the females. The other button is going to be what the authors of the Pleasure Trap call a magic button. And this essentially is going to open a little hatch in his cage, and a female will be presented to him that's been injected with sex hormones to make her incredibly promiscuous, shall we say. Now, I want you to think for a moment about which button the grey shrike is going to learn to press. And what we see time and time again across a number of different animals and species is essentially they're going to press the magic button, because they want that instantaneous pleasure, and sexual intercourse is the most pleasurable natural endeavor that animals can engage in. They're certainly not going to have any accidents. There's a lot of, the potential threats with other mates, maybe trying to interfere with him building his nest, maybe accidentally having some sort of injury from collecting those bugs and thorns and sticks and whatever else. There's lots of stuff where he's going to want to avoid the pain as well. And again, if he's got the female of his species that's there and ready to copulate, that also saves him a lot of energy, having to engage in all of this activity and behavior. But we can mess with the grey shrike even more. We can actually change the blue button, the non-magic button, I think it was in this example, to an even more magic button. And what we can do then is we can put a little vial of crystal methamphetamine or crack cocaine or heroin in the corner of his cage. And what we find is even if we introduce multiple females that are promiscuous, he will actually completely ignore them. He actually ends up ignoring his food and his water, and he will press the button for more of that illicit substance over and over again until he drops down dead. That is the reality. And what's going on here is that his brain chemistry has been completely hoodwinked. His neural circuitry is telling him that he's doing the right thing. And one of the main reasons for this is the the neurotransmitter, I believe it's known as, is dopamine. And there's a lot of talk about dopamine at the moment. You can get onto all sorts of different podcasts that will tell you that dopamine is, the sort of natural equivalent of heroin and whatever else. But this really misses the point. Dopamine is a lot more complex than just something you become addicted to. And while it is addictive, it doesn't actually kind of work quite like that. What dopamine does is it's about seeking, it's about driving you towards the next thing. And in many respects, anticipation is almost as important as the result, and in some cases actually more so. For example, some people talk about the thrill of pursuing a sexual partner being even more exciting than the actual act of sexual intercourse itself. Drug addicts talk about taking possession of the drug is actually more calming than taking the drug. So there's some very interesting and complex psychology that we don't have time to get into with dopamine. But what I will say is it's more complex than maybe the odd podcast might let you think it is. So what's going on is that all sorts of biochemicals are being released in the Gray Shrike's mind that kind of have no right to be there. And I'm talking here about the drugs that he's taking. Yeah, the heroin, the crystal methamphetamine, the crack cocaine. What they're doing is they're releasing into his mind hundreds, if not thousands of times more dopamine and serotonin and other sorts of opioids and whatever else, far more than nature ever intended. Like I say, in some cases, thousands of times more. And what this does, unfortunately, is it gives us these really amazing feelings. We feel like we're being incredibly successful at a biological level when actually these are the sort of behaviors that will cause us to either quickly or slowly self-destruct. And if you look at any addiction that people suffer from in the world, in almost all instances, it's something that has either been created or massively accelerated in the post-industrial world. Because what we're doing is we're hijacking the things that make us us, the biology that makes us us, all animals, that makes all animals who they are, this motivational triad and a lot of other complexities too. And we're essentially bypassing hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and just taking, I suppose, what I sometimes call the shortcut to enlightenment. You know, the heroin addict that's all strung out on heroin is in a place of utter calm and peace in the moment that they are ingesting and high or on the drug. But, of course, the problem is as soon as you remove that, you get withdrawal, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. You know, our evolutionary history for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years dealt with very different problems to the problems that we encounter today. Now, the life of the early hunter-gatherer was a very difficult life, but it was also a simple life, where you essentially just needed to find your food, find water, find shelter, find warmth, keep fire, eventually reproduce to keep the tribe going. Now, I'm not saying it was easy, but it was simple. But I want you to think about the to-do list that you've had to action just today. You couldn't have done all the things without the timetable telling you where you need to be, all the different things that you have to do before school, when you get to school, the assignments you need to hand in for your homework. And you know, it's a complete minefield, the modern world. We're so full of different features. You know, entertainment bombards us on our screens 24/7 and is one of the most highly addictive parts of the modern world. And even more worryingly, that taps into a really deep part of who we are as people, social creatures, and the rise of social media. As much as you all love social media, I don't think any of you are going to try and tell me that it isn't something that causes you a lot of upset and damage at times, no matter how good it feels. But remember, drug addicts feel good when they take drugs, yeah? Junk food addicts feel good when they're eating, but they feel terrible about the weight gain afterwards. All of these addictions feel good in the moment. And remember, our neural circuitry is designed to exist and flourish in a world of scarcity. Our ancestors, upon finding food in the past, would have just stuffed their faces with as much of it as they possibly could, and maybe taken as much as they could back to the tribe. Because you didn't know what other creature was going to get hold of it in the meantime. And you needed that food now, because most of our ancestors were slowly starving to death. Indeed, about 15 out of 16 deaths traditionally were from starvation or misadventure, misadventure usually associated with trying not to starve. But the world we live in today is very different. People are dying instead from what used to be called the diseases of kings, things like cancer, diabetes, gout, and all the rest of it. Now, this is an unusual state of affairs for us to find ourselves in. And it would be reasonable for you at this point to say, well, so what? You know, we've got modern medicine. We can keep ourselves alive much longer than we ever used to. And if I can kind of live on that high of, you know, eating lots of junk food, drinking lots of alcohol, you know, maybe even taking some illicit substances, like why the hell not, right? Maybe it might cost me a few years, but I'm going to go out on a high, right? I'm going to feel good while I'm doing it. And Sigmund Freud believed that he had found the ultimate cure to humanity's problems, one of the earliest psychologists. And he used to prescribe cocaine to all of his patients and his friends and his family. And it was only upon the suicide of one of his best friends that he realized perhaps this wasn't quite the wonder drug that he'd thought it was. And the big issue, the big enemy here is neural adaptation. I want you to think of the smell like when you go onto a farm or maybe into a classroom and it smells really bad. And within a couple of minutes, that smell's gone away. Now, I use inverted commas there because the smell actually hasn't gone anywhere. Rather, your brain is just ignoring the smell that's still there. This is a process that's also known as habituation. And while the next graphic is focused on diet, and this is taken straight from the book, The Pleasure Trap, you can apply any type of addictive behavior to it. And this kind of answers that really difficult question as well that we had at the beginning, right? Because when you enter the top zone, the kind of red zone that you can see there in phase 2, what's actually happening is you're being lifted into this enhanced sense of sort of feelings. The dopamine, the serotonin, the endogenous opioids, they've all gone through the roof. And you're thinking and feeling like this is the best it's ever going to be. But unfortunately, that doesn't last. Unfortunately, same as the smell of the classroom or the farm or whatever else, your body eventually, anytime it's prevented with a super stimuli of any type, it's going to ignore it eventually. And what happens is, you can see here, while the initial, you know, because drug addicts are always talking about their first high, yeah? That initial high is what you're always chasing. And then, unfortunately, you go from zone 2, this really elated sense of the world and your experience of it, into zone 3. And this is habituation, and this is the kicker. Because what's happened now is you're in a position where you need to take whatever it is, whatever the addiction is. You need to engage in that behavior simply to feel normal. And the big, big problem is when we then take whatever that is away. If we take the junk food away, the food then tastes disgusting, whereas before it tastes normal. If you take the heroin away from a heroin addict, the world feels intolerable, whereas before it felt normal. But in order for it to feel normal, you had to be taking the heroin the whole time. And this is the great paradox at the center of modern human living. And it kind of answers that question. Yeah, when we know all the health risks associated with all of what I've been talking about, why do we still kind of get it wrong? And I think part of the answer to this is that when we do the wrong thing, i.e. when we move from zone 1 into zone 2, as you can see on the graphic there, it feels right. Our biochemistry is giving us all these signals to say you're doing the right thing. The real shame is that we then, when we try and do the right thing, when we try and kick the habit, we enter zone 4. We enter withdrawal. And very few people are able to move from zone 4 to zone 5 being recovery. Because they are thinking and feeling that they are missing something very, very important. And they are missing something. They're missing the biochemistry that they became acclimatized to and used to. So much of this long-term destructive behavior that we experience in this world is seen by our neural circuitry as some of the most successful ever experienced. Anytime you're on your screen scrolling, your brain is telling you you're doing a good thing. Whereas we know that actually that's a negative behavior in the long term. Whenever you're sat, you know, drinking booze or whatever it might be, and you're feeling great, more chatty, more energetic, whatever else, feels really good, so you do more of it. And the more you do of it, the more you acclimatize to it, and the more it becomes normal. And if you are ending up taking a substance simply to stave off the feelings of withdrawal, well, then you know you've got a big problem on your hands. And if you see that in people that you know and love, you also have an issue on your hands, albeit indirectly. Because we know that addiction is bad, but our bodies and our subconscious selves just scream out for more time and time again. And it's you know, zone 3 and trying to move from zone 3 through 4 to 5 is a really, really tough endeavor and something that many people actually fail to do. Now, I've given you the bad news. I think it's worth spending a couple of minutes just thinking, and I would encourage you to think about what sort of things can you do to help make this better in your lives and the lives of those that you know, respect, and love. Because I've kind of given you a rationale here. It's a little bit like going up to a heroin addict and saying, well, here's the biochemistry as to why you're doing what you're doing. You should be fine now. And of course, that's not going to cure things one bit. Instead, we need to be a little bit more pragmatic. So here are some possible solutions or responses, as I've labeled them, that you can consider. Clearly, and most importantly, professional medical treatment advice, and in some cases rehabilitation, are going to be absolutely paramount. And if you're suffering significantly with a problem that's been ongoing for years, then this might be something that you need to consider. I would, however, just encourage all of you to try and take up as natural a life as you possibly can, kind of go back to basics. Try and live in line with your evolutionary history. Yeah, try and do one of three things, preferably all three, right? But a combination is fine too. Try and engage in some movement outdoors with other people, because that's a really good replication of our hunter-gatherer ancestry. It's part of the reason why team sports are so popular, because they replicate the kind of the hunting and gathering process of teamwork aimed towards a telos, a goal. And it doesn't have to be team sports. Maybe you could just go on a walk with a podcast in. Maybe you could go and play a board game with some friends, or whatever it might be. There's lots and lots of different examples of this. You know, maybe switch your MMORPG for a game of chess, like IRL, you know, like over a board, where you can have some conversation that isn't on a headset. I would also recommend maybe trying to reduce your reliance on pills and tablets. I'm not talking about prescription medication, of course, but we're a pill-popping nation. If we've got a problem, we tend to want to just sort it by taking something. And I think that just cultivates really bad habits in our lives, because then if we have like some sort of mental crisis a little bit later on in life, it's like, well, I'm just going to take a tablet, you know? And I would say that actually trying to work through these things and staying present and staying connected with the world is actually the best way of trying to deal with these things. But not the only way, of course. We've talked a lot about the understanding and acknowledgement of the fact that we live in a difficult world, in the modern world. And I've mentioned as well about trying to see ourselves in an evolutionary light. Now, part of the reason I'm not dressed in school uniform, even though I'm a teacher of philosophy, is because I'm also the head of yoga here at Abingdon School. And I'm obviously going to try and plug that as a solution to this as well. You know, things like mindfulness, which is just another word for meditation, which is just another word for yoga. These are all really good activities to help you, I guess, build another layer of protection against many of these negative phenomena that we've been discussing today. Psychological association is also a big point here. You know, if you can just leave the phone downstairs, if you find yourself just doom scrolling for 8 hours in the evening and not getting any sleep into the night time. You know, I don't keep junk food in the house because I have a terrible problem. If it's there, I'm just going to eat it. I don't have any alcohol at home, you know, because I'm just going to get drunk if I have it. You know, I don't go to pubs, I don't go to bars, I just avoid association. And that took a little bit of time, and that took some, you know, some real ribbing from my friends as well, as if there was something wrong with me. I was called a variety of different names and told that I was a loser and whatever else, but I think there's an irony to those sentiments from those individuals, and you know, I don't really hang out with those sort of people anymore because they're no good for you. A lot of the time, addicts will want to kind of bring others into the fold of addiction, and I'm not saying that I was, you know, socializing with a load of alcoholics, but you know, you can see that that's the sort of thing that is often quite important to consider in all of this, like who you are mixing with, and you know, the sort of people that you're regularly associating with. They're going to have a big impact on your behavior. Are they trying to lift you up and make you the best version of you that they can, or are they trying to drag you down to their level? And I think that's an important question to ask. And finally, I guess it's what we've been doing here today. Just educate yourselves. You know, go and look into more of this stuff. Check out, like, I know there's a lot of talk about Andrews at the moment, and Andrew Tate's definitely the wrong one. I think Andrew Huberman, as a podcaster, an evolutionary biologist, and I was about to say a psychoanalyst, a sort of a neuroscientist, he's a fantastic starting point here. And he's someone that's going to give you the sort of tools you will need to, you know, flourish more fully in this crazy thing that is the modern world. So thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting, and I wish you all the best of luck dealing with many of the complex and difficult things we've been talking about today. Thank you and good luck.